Thanks for watching our video on the quick individual risk assessment tool available at travsafe.com.au/QIRA. A number of people have asked us for some detailed instructions on how to use this tool. Well, the first thing people should do is recognise that it's an Microsoft Excel tool. Make sure you've got Excel active on your machine. Download it from the URL I just cited and save it on your desktop. Now this risk assessment tool is designed for Australian travellers, particularly those who are going overseas for the first time, perhaps first-time travellers, to get an indication of the overall risk of travel. It identifies the major risks by type and provides some advice on how people can reduce the risk of travel in different locations. It seeks to measure the underlying risk of the travel and the state of your preparations. You may prefer to do things on your own, which is fine, but if you want to do that, then I think you should be fully aware of the risks. Obviously, this tool is optimised for the more riskier destinations, and people who are having a simple trip to Hong Kong, Australia, Hong Kong, back to Australia, will find this tool returns pretty low risk results for them. But those who are heading to more complex countries with more complicated security environments, political environments, risks of natural disasters, etc., will get a better indication of the comparative risks of travel. Now, the important thing here is that if the risks are judged by the tool to be medium or elevated, it is important then to go on to do the long individual risk assessment at travsafe.com.au/LIRA, because that will help you further identify the areas that you need to focus on. Now, the first thing that we recommend people do is to decide up front what activities they will and won't do. For example, to what extent are you prepared to travel by sea? Are there any limits on your willingness to travel by sea? Have a look at that boat there in Bangladesh. I certainly wouldn't want to get on board of that. There are other rules you can apply to your travel that also limit your risk, say from having your valuables stolen by pickpockets. Exposure to petty crime can be controlled by some pretty simple responses, such as deciding where and when you will travel. The dark alley, for example. Well, if I was in a place that I didn't know that well, I would rule out travel at night in places that were not well lit and not well trafficked. It's just a basic security precaution. So we call that a safe travel behaviour, and we would encourage you to have a look at the list of safe travel behaviours that are on the website at travsafe.com.au/STB. The other important point is to decide in advance the extent to which you are going to do your travel through bookings in hotels, have bookings for travel, extra sort of day trips or trips out of the major cities, to do that in a structured way through a travel company, or whether you're just going to do it on public transport. We would recommend that you start to make bookings as soon as for the most, even the most mundane of travel arrangements, to have a plan and to make sure that your plan is well thought through and you've considered the risks. Now, once you've downloaded the tool, the first question that is asked is about gender. Now, sadly, it's a fact of life that in places such as the Middle East or even in India, there is a greater reported instance of sexual harassment, assault, and some pretty old-fashioned attitudes to the place of women, which won't go down well at all with many Australian travellers. What we'd like people to do is up front recognise that there are places where women are at greater risk if they're travelling, and to consider if it's a particularly elevated threat, where you're at greatest, where you are most vulnerable, to look for ways of reducing that vulnerability, and even if it's remote travel in a place like India, female travelling on her own, perhaps inexperienced and anxious, then to look at options like taking a friend or joining a group tour. Now obviously that won't suit everybody, but the tool will start, as you progress through the other 10 questions, it will start to show you where factors such as gender and remote location start to compound the consequences of an adverse outcome. The other very important point, in fact the most important factor determining the underlying risk of your travel, is to work out what the country travel risk score is. Now there's a pop-down menu. Every country that is suitable for tourism is mentioned there, and it will tell you what the underlying score is. Now this score is determined on the basis of travel advisories issued by governments, of risk of natural disasters, of crime, diseases that don't exist in Australia, and the quality of transport and health systems. For example, Singapore scores a 4. The Philippines scores 25. The Philippines is immediately an elevated travel risk for Australian tourists because of the presence of many more risk factors than are present in Australia. So, first point to make here is that people need to consider whether that underlying risk is acceptable to them. Don't make a booking to a place like the Philippines unless you are happy to accept the risk, the underlying risk that every Australian traveller would face, based on those ratings that are in the travel advisories and are in the private consultancies' risk ratings for issues that would confront the ordinary Australian traveller. Now, in making the point that Singapore rates a 4, but should also mention that even a place like Singapore, relatively benign security environment, there are things you need to think about. Diseases, dengue, chikungunya, that type of thing. Things that you won't confront, in Melbourne or Sydney. The other pretty important factor is whether you are travelling alone. Now, obviously, travelling alone increases your vulnerability to a range of risks, including crime, but it also makes it more difficult to respond to an accident, say, if you are on your own in a place that's unfamiliar, in a place where you don't understand the language, more difficult to get support and assistance. Obviously, if you're travelling with a friend and your friend is less badly off than you are, then you can rely upon your travel buddy to assist you in that regard. We think that teaming up's a good idea if you're concerned about the risks of travelling alone. Obviously, women travelling alone in certain locations, there's a compounding risk that arises there. You might like to consider ways of reducing your potential exposure to adverse events, say by identifying the most dangerous activity you'll be undertaking, and that will probably be remote area travel, and think about what you can do to reduce the risks there. Should you go on a tour with other people? Should you go with a friend? Should you look at the time of day you're proposing to do that remote area travel to reduce the risks and the consequences to you from, say, a traffic accident or opportunistic crime occurring out there? Now, in making the point about the benefits that accrue for someone who travels with a buddy, you need to make sure you know what they're like. You should travel with them before, perhaps in Australia, and know what they're like in a difficult situation, because there would be nothing worse than being out in a remote area in a difficult situation with someone who's coping even less well than you are. The further questions on the tool relate to whether or not this is just a single city or location visit. Are you going beyond your port of arrival? Say if you're going to Thailand, you're flying into Bangkok, are you going anywhere else? If you are, that adds to the complexity, because travelling to multiple locations beyond your point of arrival increases risk in a number of areas, but what we want people to think about up front while they're doing their initial planning is the extent to which they're prepared to move on to other places and how they're going to do it, recognising that that is an exposure to a range of uncertain events. Travel, could be higher levels of crime in other areas, there could be poorer roads, there could be diseases, illnesses, other factors that you're just not aware of. Remote area travel is another key area of risk. Obviously, travelling in a remote area makes it more difficult for you to draw on ordinary services you'd expect to find in Australia. If you have an accident, more difficult to get an ambulance out there, if at all there is an ambulance service in this country. It's one of those areas where consequences quickly compound, and remote area travel, obviously, from the point of view of controlling those risks, it's best to have nailed down all your bookings and even go to the extent of moving away from from public buses, trains, even private coaches, even group tours, to get to the point where you're renting your own car and driver for those particularly risky and remote areas, in order to ensure that you can control every aspect of that movement. Can you even on a coach tour, even on a tour catering to other Westerners, can you make sure that there is no side travel in difficult areas at times of the day when the risk of accidents is higher? We think that by hiring a car and driver, you can better control that risk by being in command of where that driver goes, what time he goes, and where of course you'll be stopping. Excuse me. Travel insurance, another factor in compounding risk. Obviously, having travel insurance won't mean that you're less likely to suffer an adverse event. It just reduces the personal consequences to you. We say that travelling uninsured is just reckless. You shouldn't do it. It's stupid. You should be thinking about what will happen to you if you're robbed, if you need to get to hospital and pay for it, if you are in an accident and you are not insured. You want to be thinking about at all times whether the activity you're doing will invalidate your travel insurance. You'll be wanting to think about what details you'll need to have on you in case you're involved in an accident to ensure that you get timely hospital attention. I mean, there are instances where hospitals in some of the bigger Southeast Asian cities have not treated people because they have not had proof of travel insurance, even though they were insured, and there have been some horrendous consequences arising from that. So it's something that you want to have on you at all times, the information about your insurance policy, so that if you are injured, it can be easily accessed by those who are seeking to help you. Adventure tourism is another area of risk that needs to be considered when you're getting this snapshot view of your risks of travel. Obviously, things like skiing, quad biking, skydiving add to the risk. Your insurance company will see it that way, and they will probably charge you a higher premium for undertaking those activities. But if you want to do it, then that is really what you must do, is get that covered. You need to recognise also that the consequences of an accident whilst, say, bungee jumping in a place like Bali might be far higher than what they are in Australia. It might be harder to get to a hospital. It might be more difficult to get the specialist treatment that you need if you've damaged your spine. It also might be a case of the safety standards being far lower. So that is a key area of additional risk for Australian travellers that we wish to highlight. Before going on any overseas trip, it's important to consider what additional health or disease risks you'll be exposed to. Travelling overseas is stressful even at the best of times, but travelling to a difficult location where you might have an underlying medical condition, perhaps one that the doctor doesn't want to see you travelling with, and that is a factor that must be taken into account when you're planning your travel. The doctor, by seeing the travel doctor within 2 months of departure, you can start also to think about the vaccinations and boosters you might need. You can start considering whether or not there are health risks in that particular location that you haven't taken into account. Rabies, for example, is endemic in many Southeast Asian locations. It's not just dogs that carry rabies, it's also carried by monkeys and other mammals. Something to think about if you're going to a remote area where there are, say you're going to a nature park, that you may well be exposed to monkeys and dogs. So think about that. Think about what you'll do if you are exposed also, because the treatment for something like rabies is pretty horrendous, and it often involves a trip back to Australia simply because the prophylaxis won't be available where you are. So seeing your doctor is an important factor. You should mark that in on the tool. And if you haven't seen your doctor, obviously that's a risk factor that you'll need to take into account, and you'll need to start making some immediate plans to protect yourself. Many Australians travel with prescription medication, non-prescription medication. Some of it is essential, some of it may well just be desirable. If you are carrying essential prescription medication overseas and you lose it, then that could be a showstopper. That might mean the end of your holiday. Might not. Sometimes prescription medication is readily replaceable. Say there's a generic. You might be somewhere like India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, where they'll be able to give you every medication under the sun, perhaps generic or perhaps a clone. It might not be the same as taking the medication you were prescribed, and really it would not be very desirable to go on under those circumstances. But if you are carrying a complex prescription medication that is essential, and you lose it, say for a heart condition or for a stress condition, you might find that you cannot replace it. You might find that it's not even legal in the place you're going to. So consider that, and consider how you will protect that essential prescription medication to make sure it's not stolen or in a bag that ends up being lost, whatever. Many ways you can lose it. You could also lose it at the airport if the authorities deem that it is not legal. What are you going to do then? Consider also what else is in your medical kit. There are a number of instances where people have been arrested, even for carrying non-prescription medication. Totally ruin your holiday. Obviously, you'll be there for a lot longer than you anticipated trying to straighten out a matter like that. Codeine-based medications in the medical kit that you're carrying, they are a red light, a red flag rather, for the authorities in many countries. Check out whether or not you are carrying something that is illegal, and comply with the restrictions that may be imposed by the country you're going to. For example, UAE has a procedure for importing medication. Pretty straightforward. Does take some time to get your head around it and to plan, but that is one of the tasks we're trying to prepare people for with this tool, i.e. better planning. So check out the embassy's website in Canberra, the embassy of the country you're going to. Probably in Canberra, could be in another country if it's a more remote place, and make sure you understand what the rules are for importing both prescription and non-prescription medications that you may be carrying. Now, bookings are another factor that affect the state of people's the plans, the extent to which you can cope with an adverse outcome, and the extent to which you can control the environment in which you're travelling. Now, if you've not got bookings and you're just planning on turning up at the airport and sorting things out there, then you expose yourself to a range of risks. At the airport, in a place like New Delhi, it would be very stressful to have to find a hotel and find a way of getting to the hotel. Try not to get ripped off in the process. If you have pre-arranged bookings, it feeds into your travel planning process. You know where you'll be. You can tell others where you'll be. you know what services will be available to you. You can make plans for things like internet access, phones, phone numbers will be known to you, so you can nail down those arrangements. So if anyone does need to contact you, they can. You might think it's a great idea to fly by the seat of your pants, say in some location, say like you're heading to Sri Lanka. You might think you might be able to not have very firm plans in the capital, but nail them down firmly in riskier areas, say for trips out of the capital. That's fine too. But what we're saying is the best practice for safe travel is to make sure that you've got a plan, that others know what your plan is, and that bookings are an essential first step in firming up your plans, obviously. The duration of travel is another risk factor, but not an overwhelming factor on its own. Duration, obviously, if you're out for more than 2 weeks, you're exposed to a greater level of risk than if you were out just for 1 week. It's quite clear. It's not a major problem to be travelling for longer. It's just something to think about. Perhaps you can reduce your exposure towards the end of your travel by planning to do some things first when there are others. First up, when there are others around, perhaps you might be able to plan around activities that could be done at the beginning or the end to reduce consequences. Say going to an area where there may be a higher risk of a particular disease, then you might want to do that towards the end so you don't fall sick when you are in the country that you're travelling in. Falling sick back in Australia would be pretty dreadful also, but at least you wouldn't be falling sick overseas. I'm thinking particularly about incubation periods for diseases like chikungunya, dengue, malaria, etc. Even rabies, something to think about. But basically, it's another factor that would underpin the quick risk assessment, and to be travelling for a longer period would contribute to a higher score. One of the other most significant risks that people face when overseas, particularly in developing countries, is the risk of having their credit card compromised. Now look, the days of travellers' checks are well and truly over. It's all electronic these days. That's the most convenient way of accessing your funds. But you need to make sure that you are not compromised, that you have at least a secondary source of funds that can assist you, or someone back home who's prepared to transfer money to you via Western Union. Skimming is endemic, sadly, in some places, and in some places you'd be surprised about as well. So what you want to do is to have one card in an envelope in another place that wouldn't be on you all the time, perhaps secreted somewhere in one of your bags that you're going to be locking up in the hotel, and keeping it fresh. So if your first card, your primary card, is compromised, you can get yourself through the rest of your trip by bringing out your fresh card and using that. Now, in accessing that secondary card, you would want to make sure that you're only using it to draw cash. You would want to make sure that you're not using it again in a dangerous way. Think about ways of avoiding the risk of skimming in the first place. Basically, never let the card out of your sight. Restaurants are notoriously risky places for skimming fraud. So make sure that if you are going to a restaurant in a place where the risk is high, just use cash. It's much better. Might not assist you with the record keeping, but it's better than having your details, your personal information stolen like that. So what you find is a picture emerging in your tool of the overall level of risk. In this particular case, the case of a travel by a young Australian university student, female university student, to Sri Lanka. She's facing an elevated risk simply because there is remote area travel and there is some adventure tourism activities there. She's also not gone to see the doctor, so there's no certainty at all around the status of her vaccinations against some quite preventable illnesses that are kicking around at the moment, such as measles, etc. So given the outcome from this risk assessment process, what we would be recommending is that the traveller complete the long individual risk assessment, which is on the link shown on the slide here. We'd also recommend that, as a matter of course, the traveller also looked at the information on the TravSafe website elsewhere. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope that was helpful.